Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, From Threats to Solutions, Cybersecurity in Academic Libraries, an SNSI Security Summit, which is sponsored by the Scholarly Network Security Initiative, SNSI. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Now I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars or watch previous webinar recordings. Also, if you're interested in library technology, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on academic librarians, faculty, researchers, administrators, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products as they relate to productivity, accessibility, discovery, and more. You can find out more about LTI and read the blog or sign up for our newsletter via the links in the chat. Okay, now before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers or to share any comments. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version and where to access today's slides. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Matt.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. And hello, good afternoon, good morning to everyone on this call. My name is Matthew Rigucci. I'm the Director of Institutional Product Marketing at Wiley and a member of the University Relations Working Group for the Scholarly Network Security Initiative, or SNSI, today's webinar sponsor. I'm honored to be here to help moderate this webinar on the critical topic of cybersecurity in academic institutions. And before we dive in, I just want to briefly, they'll introduce themselves, but introduce our panelists and who you'll be hearing from today. Heather Flanagan, who's principal at Spherical Cal Consulting. Emily Glenn, who is the dean at the McGugin Health Sciences Library at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. Michelle Pochow, who is the electronic resources librarian at the University of California, Davis. And last but not least, Carlota Sage, the founder and community CISO at Pocket CISO. And each of our panelists bring a wealth of experience from different areas of cybersecurity in academic institutions. And they'll be guiding us through a range of important topics today, from real-world breach scenarios to the unique cybersecurity challenges that libraries face. In our agenda for today, I'll start by talking about the SNSI and set the academic cybersecurity stage with some context, and then I'll hand over to our first panelist, Emily, who will kick things off by exploring a real-life cybersecurity breach that affected an academic institution, its resolution, and lessons learned. Then we'll turn to Carlota to hear about the latest trends and vectors that are posing new threats to academic institutions and how we can mitigate risks along the supply chain and protect our institutions from vulnerabilities. Next, we'll hear from Heather, who will dive into the intersection of browser authentication and library technology. And Michelle will be our final panelist, taking a broader look at cybersecurity, specifically in libraries, exploring challenges and discussing how libraries can strengthen their defenses in the ever-evolving digital landscape. And then we will wrap up with a question and answer session where you can ask your questions you have about the topics we've covered. And it's really a great opportunity, I think, to dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues that the panelists are going to discuss that are relevant to your institution or clarify anything from today's discussion. So feel free to utilize that question and answer module that Sabrina introduced earlier. So about the Scholarly Network Security Initiative. Well, the SNSI, for short, brings together publishers and institutions to tackle cyber challenges that threaten the integrity of the scientific record, research systems, and personal and institutional data. And although the SNSI is focused on higher education and research organizations, our resources and webinars are also relevant for other types of libraries and cultural heritage organizations. Some facts and figures to help us understand why it is we are talking about cybersecurity in academic institutions. So the education sector was identified as the third largest target for cybercrime. That's ahead of retail. Higher education in particular is often perceived as a soft target for hackers looking to exploit the institutional vulnerabilities. Fake websites and login pages have also been popping up and spoofing library websites to steal institutional login credentials. And the research that's done in academic institutions is often as valuable as personal or financial data. And speaking of financials, one institution ended up paying over $1 million to resolve a ransomware issue whilst they were working on a vaccine for COVID-19. And over 400 universities and institutions across 41 countries have reported their networks and data compromised by illegal websites. So this is quite a pervasive problem that you'll hear a little bit more from our panelists about. And before I hand over to Emily, I'd just like to ask a quick poll, which will help us establish a benchmark on the impact of our webinar. And so the question is, and it's popping up now, how comfortable are you with your institution's current cybersecurity measures and preparedness? Are you very comfortable, somewhat uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable? So if you could answer the poll, I will give about 30 seconds to review the choices here. Just give everyone a chance to answer your level of comfort of your institution's cybersecurity measures and preparedness. Okay, I think we've given enough time, and the results, a little bit of a bell curve here around ranging from very comfortable to somewhat uncomfortable. Most folks are somewhat comfortable, which is great. And we hope that at the end of this webinar, we'll get you to that top tier of feeling very comfortable, or at least a little bit more informed in decisions and strategies around taking action at your respective institutions. So there is going to be another similar poll at the very end of this presentation. So yeah, as I said, just kind of hold on to the end so we can ask that question again. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Emily to talk about breach resolution and lessons at your institution.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Greetings, everyone. My name's Emily Glenn. I'm the Dean at McGugin Health Sciences Library at University of Nebraska Medical Center in Omaha, Nebraska. I have been in a leadership position here for a couple of years, but have had opportunities over 8 years to work with libraries, technologies, and in increasing roles with our university's IT department. So I will tell you a little bit about our situation in fall of 2020, and then some things that have transpired in the past 4 years to bring us to present day. So the setting, I work in an academic medical center, so that is a university and teaching hospital that's combined in many ways. The University of Nebraska Medical Center is spread across 500 miles and is spread in 4 physical locations. We have one hospital system that has multiple clinics that provides training space for students. And our university and hospital systems share one IT service and system that allows for some permeability and some opportunity for people to move back and forth. On September 20th, 2020, our IT department identified some unusual network activity that affected some of its IT systems. And this is happening in the library too, with our shared technologies. So I'm going to tell you about our experience making it through a cyber attack. Um, so September 20th was a big day, and soon after learning about some problems with its system, the university's IT team and campus leaders initiated incident response protocols to minimize disruptions to patients and to folks in the UNMC and Nebraska Med System. They isolated potentially impacted devices and shut off some systems as precaution. They also initiated investigation, engaging computer forensic experts and notifying law enforcement. 5 days after the activity, we see public communication like this on the screen. So the bold is mine to kind of call attention to some of the language used, but what we see here and what I kind of reflect on, after the fact is that they address the immediate concern for business, recognize that many people were involved in the resolution, talked about continuity, reaffirmed that the mission is strong, and expressed their commitment to making sure that there was damage control and that they're working toward prevention for the future. This message, as you can see, was picked up by local news channels, which is the source of this side here. So there are a lot of reasons why cybersecurity is important in institutions, and one of the questions built into my presentation is why do institutions care? As it's probably a common response for all of us, technology is coming at us fast. And the shape of this chart might be somewhat familiar to you. This originated in 2016 with a Thomas Friedman talk about the acceleration of technology. And this kind of chart has been used in many places. So institutions and within them libraries are making decisions about what to adopt, restrict, what to build amidst this increasingly dizzying array of new technologies, um, and with a lot of kind of competition in the environment. And so for libraries, that might look like how we're approaching information literacy around deep fakes, how things have just changed with how we're talking about information seeking behaviors, how we recommend items to users, just kind of a range of things. And we are, as everyone who uses a chart like this, um, we would say we are here with the arrow or the circle, or we're approaching here. And there's this here that is the technology kind of surpassing human capability and intelligence. So technology touches all of these places in a university where we can think about implications for distance learning, enrollment and admissions, research used for basic sciences and health sciences in my situation. And then in each of those environments, we can think about this essential data loss, business disruption, financial, reputational damage, things like that. So um, this interesting intersection of lots of technology and also lots of opportunities for things to um, potentially go very right or to go a little bit sideways. So we do our institutional work, of course, within the context of the world and all of its possibilities, technological flops, issues, advances, and such. So universities looking inside, why do we care? Because we operate in this same environment with a lot of these same opportunities and risks. So my institution is also this is current kind of present day. Um, my institution is showing that it cares about cybersecurity. It did show in fall of 2020 that it did care about cybersecurity. We did have trainings. The university environment was very strong on required training. We had a lot of information about how to um, avoid, clicking on bad links, and there's fair amount of awareness. It happens to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month now, good timing. And of course, there's a fishing tournament happening this month at my institution. Um, but thinking too about why institutions care and why I care as a library, why we care so much, because cybersecurity touches the people that are within the institution, and particularly reflecting on the recently released 2024 EDUCAUSE Horizon report um, about security and privacy, cybersecurity and privacy. There's a lot of discussion about students and when it comes to basic student life and things that students need, resources that the library might be a good partner in providing. There's some areas where there could be things that are turned into scams, for example, textbooks. Um, and other things that target students like job offers, debt relief, moving services, et cetera. And so if students are more vulnerable to scams and potentially more impacted, we have to think about kind of what that looks like from the library side, how the university addresses that, the library being a unit in the university, and how we interact with all of those other systems that touch students and where they're potentially consuming information, being users of technology, and having to make decisions about safety and such. So just in the library, we need to be on top of the range of things with our business partners and kind of know about our resources before, during, and after an attack. A little bit more of some of my why is just thinking about all of the platforms for services, experiences, and research that run on technology. Um, Here in an academic medical center, we've got a lot of team science and collaboration, knowledge sharing, immersive training, remote learning, and we provide all of these for a variety of users across a great distance. And so we count on each other to do the right thing during a cyber attack and to also prevent a cyber attack that can potentially bring our institution to our knees. Of course, the library is an integral part of the education, research, and patient care enterprise here at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. So during fall of 2020, really getting to the what happened, we had a situation on campus where we experienced a cyber attack. I was associate dean. I was supervising the education and research services team in technology. We had about 28 people in the library, um, and we oversaw all the library things. We had internal technology projects. We had a system librarian. We had Maker Studio and such. Just the normal things, but we also had renovation going on. We were also experiencing COVID. We were building a museum. We had a lot of moving pieces, kind of all within a short period of time. And we we know or came to learn that in fall of 2020, the FBI warned that higher education institutions and healthcare systems were at increased risk of cyber attacks. Um, the university did experience an attack. It started its plan. All units on campus went through a really intense audit, and that intense audit identified different potential risks. And so I want to tell you about some of the areas where we took action based on the audit and some of the things that were happening at that time that were both made the situation more difficult or made it a little bit easier to move through as we were dealing with the impacts of the attack in the library. Um, so first, our authentication system. This was, of course, something that was included in our overall audit, but it was also one of the main things that helped reduce the disruption of the cyber attack for us. We had completed about a month prior to the attack, we had a security audit, and we completed implementing our new authentication system about a month before the security audit. And so when the attack happened, this was already in place. This was a many years long process to improve our authentication system so that we could manage our resources across this big enterprise where we wanted to get away from IP authentication, easy proxy, and do the right thing with respect to our clinical partners and keeping our resources separate, just the way that we license them. So our IT groups merged several years ago. They stopped differentiating IP addresses. We had to make some big decisions to move to our system that is Open Athens, and it made sense because it's more seamless for the user's workflow. Um, it uses this authentication system that's known by our IT team. We are able to put about 98% of our resources underneath it. And by fall of 2020, we were in good shape where almost everything was authenticating against Open Athens. So I'll return in a second to why this was critically important. Um, but this made our situation with the cyber attack uh, go a certain way. Um, So another thing that was happening around the cyber attack and a direct result of these audits was a new solution assessment process. And so this was a much more streamlined approach to reviewing the workflow for requesting new software solutions. And instead of just going to buy it, we had to go through a series of um, questions to assess the vendor's ability to follow good security practices and to be a good partner with the university. So they were these assessments were already kind of part of the process, but they were expanded a lot in fall of 2020. So um, we have multiple sections. This is just a sampling of questions, and it's where the information regarding the security of the project or system is compiled to be presented to information technology for review. And this whole cleanup led to a more comprehensive inventory and identification of all of our software and um, peripherals, like everything and every business owner and all of the vendors and all of the technology support. And so we actually identified a lot of things in the library that had no assessment and a lot of just technology that had been kind of hanging on that we didn't know as much about that we should have. And so um, when we when we were facing this kind of new call to do all these solution assessments, we were discovering that small publishers didn't know what to do with the form that we were sending them. We had to actually advocate for our IT team to not say go by title or go to our big um, aggregators of content and make them do solution assessments. And so became a discussion of down to what level and don't you trust us? And the library, has done these things and we have this good track record, et cetera. But we were able to lean on our Open Athens authentication, and we ended up receiving kind of a blanket pass for anything that could be connected to a modern authentication system. So, number one, the Open Athens really saved us during this solution assessment time so that we didn't have an attack that really brought us to our knees for every last bit of content that we were serving up to our users. We could have lost all of our collections for some indefinite period of time. This is the picture here is Express Scribe. This is one of our kind of problem child solution assessments where we've approved, we had it approved, we bought it, we saw malware, we had it unapproved, we got it reapproved. Now we can't buy it because of a website being blocked by our IT team, and it's one thing that we have been pushing through in conversations. And so kind of big picture about our solution assessments. While they started a little small and a little scattered, they've gotten much more um, robust and streamlined, but there's still some pieces that we have to absolutely track on. But our big thing here is knowing our software and being able to advocate for what needs to happen. Um, so just a few weeks early, we got a new ILS because our other ILS was taken down due to vulnerabilities. We were able to extract all of our data before IT took the system down, but essentially we got this notice and we had to make some really quick decisions. So we could run our old system and have some issues and kind of lose some functionality. Um, we weren't able to upgrade because of other issues, but we were actually able to figure out a way to go kind of in between. We used, pen and paper for some transactions, manually creating user accounts, et cetera. And we were able to bring up our new system really bare bones so that um, we could get something up for users. And we were really lucky because a lot of our users were remote. The parts of our collection that were circulating um, manually were very, very few, and we were able to load up our system because we had prepared for this big migration, and um, ended up being not the worst thing in the world, but it was still pretty disruptive. We had a big disruption though with digital preservation, and this is the part that's very much like, I hope it does not happen to you. We'd been ramping up our digital preservation plans and seeking to align with the National Digital Stewardship Alliance levels of digital preservation. And we were learning a lot about our collection and learning a lot about our capabilities, relationship with IT, resources, et cetera. And it was clear that we were at a much lower level than we desired to be. And so we had been focusing on four areas: creating a policy, working through inventories and processing, implementing a real digital preservation system, and then staff training. And so as part of this, we'd identified our risks and created an implementation strategy. And so we were right in the middle of doing this work when we were um, checking on our like doing fixity checks, looking at logging, looking at our access controls. Um, we had we had turned on logging in one area not too far before this attack, and then about a week before, just around the time of the attack and shortly before the security audit, we noticed that some digital files from our special collections unit were missing from the server hosted by our campus data center. So we were putting two and two together about what was happening when and where. But we discovered audit logging had been turned off. This had us start stepping through, who had access to what. We knew pretty early on not to click on the thing, and really had to invite staff to step out of all of the files, like do not touch, do not access, and just let IT kind of start doing their thing to assess and triage. But we feared we'd lost a lot of digitized works and some things born digital, things that had been entrusted to us. And um, we wanted to make all of these changes to bring up this new digital preservation system, but here we were really stymied by this attack. So um, it was going to take us a couple months, several months to figure out how bad our loss was and whether or not things were gone forever or they just needed to be found in some other location. But eventually we resolved that. It was a while. The year later, the year after, we purchased Preservica, which is a digital preservation system. By 2022, the year after that, we had everything kind of in place to get us to the level that we were seeking so that we had good practices for digital preservation. We learned a lot during this process. This is a crisis. A cyber attack is a crisis. And so some of our learning, I think, from our teams, really from our people, first, don't assume we'll be rescued. Don't assume you'll be rescued. You're going to have to report to those meetings, verify that the library and that the right person is on the recovery lists, advocate with consideration for others who may have been affected. And then just kind of thinking about the people. People are going to remember that it was really tough that time, tough and frustrating and a lot of ambiguity, but they'll also remember how you made them feel. And so it's during a stressful time, we had to fall back on our plans. We had to just acknowledge that we were in a really disruptive time. Um, Also, just taking care of people, because this is really different from everyday work. Um, Losing access to our digital files made us really realize how on top of our digital stewardship we needed to be. So we kind of learned and thought about, what are the steps that are, how can we prioritize other things that we should be thinking about so that it's not as bad in the future. Um, we, all of this now folds into our current practices so that we can um, just think about being in a better place to prevent. Maybe I'll get to that in the next slide, but um, to think about how we're going to act in similar situations. I think the hardest part was a lot of it used to be this way, or before we did this, and we learned that that just doesn't apply anymore. And so we need to think about kind of being in the next phase of how we do things. Um, we also kind of learned to think about, how things impacted how we go about our business in the library, and kind of um, how resilient we want to be in times of crisis, or in, I hope, never another cyber attack, but definitely in crisis. So along the lines of prevention, we sometimes might not have the everything to prevent the whole entire attack, but we can at least prevent it from being as debilitating as it can be. We can hopefully not be part of the problem. Of course, we follow campus training, no phishing, using appropriate access levels, several of the items here that I've kind of outlined, but really knowing about how our technology works, all of its dependencies, knowing who's on our team, how they communicate, um, who's communicating well with IT, et cetera, and knowing our helper network and our partners in the library land who can make things a little bit better um, if we need to recorrect or kind of dig out during an attack. And I think the biggest learning is that communication is going to break down some. For us, the interconnectedness of the hospital and the university system resulted in a more intense level of information security review, and um, we've really shifted considerably from being a local DIY kind of shop with some independence to really being connected across our institution's network, and um, hopefully have set ourselves up with our partners to be more resilient and to be more um, aware of potential threats so that we can avoid future disruptions. So while we sometimes can't prevent it, don't let your library team, my library team, be the one that causes it. And if it does happen, there are definitely some things that you can do to kind of be as ready as you can. And um, I look forward to hearing from others today, and thank you so much. I'll turn it over. Carlotta?
I think it helps if I unmute and everything. Hi, I'm Carlotta Sage. I am the founder of Pocket CISO. CISO is Chief Information Security Officer. That's what your universities have to guide your strategic security program. I do that in a part-time basis for several small clients at the same time. From that perspective, I've got a huge enterprise, big tech background. I've done a lot of work in communicating big technical ideas, breaking them down for small businesses. So I specifically target sub 300 person organizations. So that may apply to some of you. It may also help you just understand better how to talk to your own security team. So I'm going to talk to you today about securing the stacks, supply chain risk, and vendor management in the library space. I got my start as a virtual or part-time Chief Information Security Officer with a library, museum, and archive consortium in Atlanta many years ago. So libraries are very near and dear to my heart. So you hear a lot about supply chain, and we just heard a little bit about how the supply chain and vendor management played in our previous presentation here. What is it? Your supply chain is any people, process, or technology that enables you to fulfill your mission to serve your patrons. And that can be software vendors, that can be service providers, hardware vendors, open source tooling. We're mostly looking at your cybersecurity tools, but it can be anyone who has access to highly sensitive physical spaces. So if you have a rare book collection, for example, that needs to be climate controlled, if that climate control goes haywire or needs some regular maintenance, your HVAC company could actually be considered a supply chain threat to you and to your ability to serve your mission. So while we tend to think of it in terms of technology, it really can be anything that's going to disrupt you. And when we're talking about disruptions, you've heard about a lot of them over the years. There are some really big supply chain attacks. I think what really kicked it off back in 2020 was a company called SolarWinds. They served thousands, tens of thousands of clients. 18,000 of their clients, which was not all of their clients, but more than half were compromised when they were compromised, right? So this was actually a malicious attack. The attacker got into SolarWinds and used that to pivot into lots of other companies, federal agencies, university research divisions. It was really big news. The following year, December seems to be really popular because a lot of IT teams, are on holiday. So attackers do target the holidays. You will see a huge uptick at 4th of July, at Christmas. So we see a lot of these things come out. In 2021, Log4j is a code flaw that happened in the Java executables of Apache, which is a very, very common web server and other tooling, open source tooling that's on a lot of servers across the world. The estimate is that 40% of the networks worldwide were affected by this. This was an issue that was discovered. It was actually a code flaw. This is not somebody targeting Log4j or Apache specifically. There was a flaw in their code that could be used. It was there for 8 years before some security researchers found it. They did a responsible disclosure. Apache fixed it. But then when they had to announce it, people who didn't patch quickly were absolutely targets of malicious attacks. So in this case, this disruption was not known well until after it was already fixed, and it still was a big impact, right? A few years later, Okta is a very big provider of single sign-on for a lot of people. Over 17,000 of their customers, which were pretty much all Okta customers, were attacked when an Okta employee was phished. So 1Password was the first one to notice it. Okta took a lot of grief because in the early days, when people could have prevented a lot of issues, they were very much in denial that this was a problem. So it took months before Okta admitted just how big of an issue this was. And most recently, I think many of us felt CrowdStrike. My customers are too poor to afford CrowdStrike, so I did not experience that as a CISO. I experienced it as a traveler trying to fly on the Saturday after this happened. Delta had to everything was flying, but things were delayed and I would have missed my connection. So my choice was get stuck in Minneapolis or fly on Tuesday instead of Saturday. So I ended up flying on Tuesday. So, and in this case, it was a code flaw, but there was nothing malicious about it, right? It just so happened that it affected 84,000 Microsoft instances worldwide. That is 1% of Microsoft's install base. So from a big picture, very small percentage, but we all felt the effects of that. Not a malicious attack in any way, right? So disruption from your supply chain, while usually malicious, does not have to be. So what are you supposed to do about it, right? That's a great question. Part of understanding the impact a supplier has on you is putting together a good vendor management program. And if you are at a university that has a full-time CISO, they probably have a vendor management program. That's probably gotten dialed in over the years. If you are at a very much smaller institution, you may not know if you have a vendor management program, or your vendor management program may not involve you very much as a librarian or as an IT person for the library. You can absolutely do your own vendor management program, or if you haven't started one or you feel overwhelmed by the one that you have, let me explain how I do it with smaller customers so that we get them a good foundation so that as they grow, they can keep fine tuning. The first thing that you have to do is catalog your vendor risk. Yeah, I kind of went with the library puns, and I hope you all forgive me on that. You have to understand what your relationship with that vendor is and what they have access to, right? So I divide this into kind of two big buckets. There's a shallow relationship and a very deep relationship. Every vendor has some level of personally identifiable information of you or of your patrons, mostly you, if it's a shallow relationship. They may only have your name and phone number, or your name, phone number, and email address. That is still PII. But they're the ones, because you have given them this information, usually in support of a transaction, right? Like a retail merchant, maybe a caterer, office supplies, ordering some books. You have given them some PII, and they are now responsible for that. I am not as worried about those as I am about those deeper relationships where the vendor actually maybe has all of your employee data or all of your patron data, where maybe they've got hooks into your systems, you have hooks back into theirs. That's going to be where we're going to focus our efforts. Your HR system provider, for example, is going to have all of your employee information. Your ebook provider, simply because maybe they don't have a lot of information, right? Maybe they would normally be a shallow relationship, but because if your ebook provider goes down, you can't deliver books to your patrons. Now they're affecting your mission. Now they become a deeper relationship, right? Your HVAC maintenance provider, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got like a rare book collection or rare goods collection that has to be climate controlled, and you have maintenance on that system, and by maintaining that system, they have access to those books, or if the failure to maintain that system means that those books are at risk, now that is a deeper relationship. Now, and I'm sorry, I'm having some unstable internet connection, so I'm going to try and go a little slowly here. Once you've decided you've got a shallow and a deep relationship, dump all of those vendors that you're paying into an Excel file. It can be that simple. We don't have to run out and spend money on a big program, but it does take time. All those vendors go into an Excel sheet. You divide them by shallow, deep. Now we take our deep ones and we look at how critical are they? Are they somebody that is critical, but they're pretty easily replaced? I call those fungible. These are folks that if they go away, there's a little bit of pain maybe to replace them, but it's not going to be a big disruption to serving my mission. Critical means if they disappear, my mission is at risk. My ability to serve my patrons is now in question. So once you've made that kind of distinction, you take those critical folks, they should go into your business continuity plan, number one. But more importantly, you should know all the things that they touch. You need to know who you contact there, have a status page that you're looking at on a regular basis, those kinds of things. These are things that you can do whether or not your security team is involved with you. Ideally, your security team is involved with you. But I know that, for a smaller organization, you may not have a security team, or your security team may be so reactive to issues that are going on, they don't have time to get proactive. And so vendor management tends to drop to kind of the bottom of the list. It's unfortunate, but true. And this is something that you can do to take up some of that slack and establish that relationship. Trying to click here. Sorry. Okay, so for the vendor assessment, you want to evaluate the vendors before you onboard them when possible. But when you're starting a new program, you're going to be evaluating your existing vendors. So of course, like I said, we're going to focus on those critical vendors first. But when you're checking them in over time, your critical vendors, you want to check more often. If it's a very large provider, like your website may be on AWS or something, they're going to require a little less focus. They've got bigger security teams, right? The smaller providers, you want to check a little more often. Whether they're shallow or deep, you want to know what red flags are. So a lot of times I will ask vendors for what is called a SOC 2 attestation or an ISO certification. These are compliance frameworks that a lot of vendors have. If they don't have that framework, I ask them to fill out a vendor security a questionnaire that I get from the Vendor Security Alliance. The Vendor Security Alliance gives this questionnaire away for free. It's the closest we have to a free standard on security questionnaires. You can purchase questionnaires through other things, but those are $6,000 to $7,000 a year for a license. VSA, VendorSecurityAlliance.org, offers that security questionnaire for free. It's a great place to start. And you want to look for those kind of red flags. Have they had, Google them. Have they had a lot of breaches in the last year? When you go to their portal to log in, do they have very limited password requirements, right? I have an insurance company. I buy my life insurance through a very large vendor, and their password requirements are a minimum of 8 and a maximum of 16. And as a security person, that makes me cringe, right? So that is not secure. If there's no multi-factor authentication as a part of their package, if they're trying to upsell you on security things, those are all very large red flags for me. So if I'm doing that initial check-in and vendors are like this, I'm going to be less inclined to purchase from them, right? As you're doing that periodical review, again, once the vendors kind of pass that initial assessment, you're going to review them, the fungible, easily replaced ones, a little less often. You just don't have time to review vendors every single year. I have 30-person companies that have 500 vendors. Now, only 10 of those vendors are critical. Maybe 50 of them total are in that deep relationship, right? But there's 500 vendors total. Nobody can do that. It's not realistic. So when we're talking about that periodical review or periodic review, sorry about the pun, we really want to be sensitive to the amount of time that we have to spend, right? So prioritize your vendors by Googling or getting an RSS feed set up to let you know when there's been a breach. If there's been a breach, that's a really great time to kick off a vendor review, see how critical they are. A lot of times it's not worth the money to switch. A lot of times, that breach is what it takes for them to beef up their security. So I would never say drop a vendor just because they've had a breach. I would say that if they've had 3 or 4 in a year, they haven't learned their lesson, and maybe it is time to drop that vendor. Okay. So I think from a high level, that kind of looks at all of your vendors. And it may feel a little overly simplistic, and it's very simplistic, but it is time consuming. So you have to decide how you're going to spend that time and who you're going to focus your efforts on. I would not spend that time on those shallow relationships, especially if they're very easily replaced. And I think that's really the biggest takeaway, right? Your due diligence still requires a fair amount of faith. Like you're putting a lot of time into this, but your check relies on the vendor telling you the truth. And I know of vendors that have completely made up their compliance program because the clients have caught them at it. I have caught them at it. And if you don't know what to look for, you still are going on faith. I think the red flags that I said earlier are very simple red flags for you to take into account when you're looking at your new vendors. You're doing your best to make sure that you're protected, right? There is a power imbalance between you as a consumer and your vendor, especially if that vendor is very big, right? You don't have a lot of sticks with a larger vendor. If you are a large vendor or a large client and it's a very small vendor, you have a lot more power in that relationship and leverage it wisely, right? You don't want to make them jump through a lot of pointless hoops. I do make some of my clients' vendors jump through hoops, but I always explain why I'm doing it. And I always try to make it something that they can then pull back into their security program and make them a better supplier for all of their other clients, right? even if the vendor is kind of risky, you can still make a business decision to accept that risk. If there is no other vendor that provides that service that you need, then you may just have to take their service. That is a business decision. Risk is a business or organizational decision. Cybersecurity is just one way of managing business risk. So when it comes to all of these things, I know this is kind of a long and kind of big picture look. You can accept the risk if you need to. And that's it from me. I'm going to pass it on to Heather.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. So my name's Heather Flanagan, and I actually my background is more in the higher education landscape for IT. I used to work at Duke University as the senior manager of their systems group, and before that, I worked for Stanford University as the director of their systems group. Now, before all of that, I was very proud to get my degree in library science from UNC Chapel Hill. Now, that said, hello, my name is Heather. It's been 13 years since I last worked at a university. Since then, I've been an independent consultant, primarily working in the internet standards space. In particular, one of the spaces that I've been focused on is digital identity, specifically identity federations. And to that end, I've been doing ever so much work with the Research and Education Federation Consortia, REFEDS, which is a grassroots organization of 80 different academic identity federations, generally national federations from around the world. And I'm also heavily engaged with the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, with their Federated Identity Community Group and Working Group, talking a lot about what are happening with the browser changes, which is what brings me here today. Several of you have probably heard me talk about this. I have much larger, longer, and more in-depth presentations out there, recording. I think I've done some previously with SNSI about what's happening with the browser changes. And this is very much a bleeding edge kind of space. Some things are evolving from day to day. Some things haven't moved nearly as fast as we would like. So I'm going to go through and talk about where we are, what I know, and what may depress you later, because I expect you want answers that don't exist yet. So we've talked about an actual attack and the implications for a university library. We've talked about the supply chain, the vendors, the bottom up. Well, I'm going to look at this a little bit more from the user perspective down and how things are happening through web browsers. Why? Well, there's over 1 billion websites out there. Not nearly as many are active, but they do in fact exist. And most businesses, especially these days, have a website. COVID definitely saw so much move to an online experience, or at least make an online experience available. E-commerce, as a result, significant growth in that respect. I do my fitness training with a personal trainer via my iPad in my basement, right? There's commerce is of all shapes and sizes in terms of how people engage and purchase things or experiences through the web. And a lot of that traffic goes through Google. Matter of fact, most of that traffic goes through Google. This has so many implications for what it means for a library. It means that your users expect to be online. Your users expect a certain experience. And a lot of that experience is going to be driven by what Google intends to do or is doing. Google is not just one thing, right? When you think about Google and what Google's doing, the Google Chrome team that's responsible for their browser has nothing to do with their advertising group. And yet it does all come together in terms of what is Google trying to do in this landscape, and what does that mean for everybody? Well, what it means for everybody in the world of digital identity is that more libraries are moving to federated access rather than IP authorization. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That goes back to some of the previous presentations that I've done, where on the one hand, IP authorization, and I do say authorization rather than authentication because you're authorizing access, you're not authenticating anything or anybody. IP authorization is a great user experience, but it's also a great, if you look at it from the larger landscape of the internet as a whole, it's a great way to track activity for people. And so companies and regulators are all trying to figure out how do they stop tracking. And one of the things that they're looking at, one of many things that they're looking at, is how to control IP addresses. What's the alternative to IP addresses? Federated authentication, where an individual can use their credentials as given to them by their employer or their university or their government, something like that, in order to gain access to materials via the web. This is great stuff because the password fatigue, so they don't have to have a password for every single site they go to. It's fantastic. There are some increased security mechanisms when you're dealing with federated authentication. It does sound a lot like, yeah, but you're putting a lot of eggs in one basket. Yes and no. That one basket is definitely more strongly controlled. And you can layer on a whole lot of additional security that you couldn't necessarily do otherwise. So think about that. And it's definitely streamlining access to resources. Now, there's a couple key players when you're starting to talk about federated authentication and, well, who helps with that? We've already talked about Open Athens. Shibboleth is an open source software platform that's very common in the higher education space. There are others. Microsoft certainly has some interesting federated access tools. Okta, Ping. The big difference between those and Open Athens is the Microsofts and Pings of the world tend to do what we call bilateral federation, one-to-one, back and forth. Whereas Open Athens and Shibboleth, they do what's called multilateral federation, where you have a source that says, okay, we vetted all of the participants in terms of contracts and whatnot, such that we'll give you the metadata for everybody. So you don't have to have one-to-one agreements. We've handled all of that. That's generally a lot more efficient because the university experience, the higher ed experience with federated authentication is different. Underlying technology is similar, but the difference of the fact that we have thousands of identity providers that publishers will need to engage with, and libraries have thousands of publishers, small ones, big ones, medium-sized ones that they're going to have to deal with. Our scale for how we use federated authentication, federated access is very different from what's happening in the commercial world. So one of the biggest changes that's happening over time is in the past, when we were talking about federated access, you had your identity provider, you had your relying party, and they would talk to each other, and the browser was just sort of this window that things would pass through without actually touching anything involved. It was really just to make sure that things were displayed properly on your screen. But then the world changed. GDPR happened. Other privacy and data protection regulations happened, and browsers felt the need, Google felt the need to become an active participant in all the processes that a user would interact with. That includes the authentication process. That makes life really interesting. We want Google and Apple and Mozilla, we want them to be accountable for their part in protecting users, protecting their privacy, protecting the security of their data. So yay. But all of the protocols that are currently in use today, commonly in use today, do not expect the browser to be doing anything. And so now you've got a really interesting technical challenge because protocols like SAML, which is what Open Athens and Shibboleth tend to use, or OpenID Connect and OAuth, which is what you see when you're using, click on Google to authenticate. All of those protocols now have to be, if they don't have to be adjusted, something has to be done so that they can actually still function when there's now a browser saying, wait, user, did you mean to click on that login button? Well, that little middle part, that credential manager and the federated credential manager, those are all things that are in progress. They're not done yet. And yet the browsers are changing anyway. So we're seeing some really interesting cloudy long-term forecasts. We're seeing this, we're sort of kind of in the middle of the storm right now. It's not going to resolve today, tomorrow, or even necessarily next year. We're seeing a lot of churn in terms of what the browser is going to do, what the user experience is going to do. And there's nothing that really is going to make that stop. So yeah, but who cares? We have IP authorization, right? Right? Wrong, wrong, we don't. Or at least we don't necessarily for long. I'm focusing on the three main browser vendors, Google, Apple, and Mozilla. All three of them have something either in place or in progress to protect the IP address of people using that browser. And I've linked to the announcements to all of these things. So Google has a whole privacy sandbox set of proposals underway, one of which is for IP address protection, so that they kind of aggregate the IP addresses from their users so that you can't necessarily identify any given one. Apple actually already did something like that for their iCloud Plus subscribers. This isn't broadly available by default, but it is certainly there for any iCloud Plus subscribers, and it's called Private Relay. So there's an announcement about that. Mozilla's tracking protection. Again, that's something that they're dealing with in terms of their anti-tracking efforts. And I've got a link for you there. Are you necessarily seeing this in action right now? Maybe yes, maybe no. But what you can get from all of this is how you're using IP authorization today doesn't have all that long a lifespan. It is on the target of things that is going to change as the browsers are held accountable to protecting users. Okay, now I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm telling you right now, you're not going to like this next slide. I'm sorry about that, but the common questions I get, it's like, okay, but so IP authorization is not necessarily stable. There are these changes that are going to happen. Will moving to federated authentication just solve for this? No. No, because we have that middle layer that's being developed today, and the changes that are going to have to happen to the protocols themselves. This is not a stable environment. So just moving to that doesn't mean that your user experiences are going to just stay steady and all will be good. You're going to have to stay on top of this. All right, but do I have a time frame for when IP authorization will no longer work? No, because that's something that is, again, still under development. You can see that it's a target, but it's not necessarily something that I can give you a date that you have to migrate by May 31st, which is my birthday. Okay, well, maybe you're actually, very forward thinking and you've been hearing about digital wallets and verifiable credentials, and how is that going to impact this? That is a fantastic question, which we don't have time to cover. It's a whole big thing in and of itself. And right now, it's very, the answer kind of depends on where you are in the world. So if you want to know more about that, let the organizers know and we'll have another session. And why am I not giving you more concrete information? Because this is the bleeding edge. This is standards development in progress, combined with the very interesting world of regulation growth. So I would love to give you more concrete information. All I can give you right now is awareness that yes, if you're starting to see some strange behaviors with your web browsers, that is to be expected. And yeah, you just sort of need to continue to pay attention as best you can as these changes go underway. I wish I had more concrete information for you, but I don't. And with that, I shall hand over to Michelle.
Wow, Heather, that leaves me in quite a spot. I'm Michelle Polchow, and I've been at UC Davis Library for about 6 years, and about the same in a previous library, about the same size. And I came to library school as a second career. So I had a lot of technology background and license negotiation, which I no longer do directly, but kind of manage the life cycle of electronic resources in a technical services department. I have 2 staff that work for me. And basically, we're in a constant state of troubleshooting. My prior speakers can attest to keeping up with all of the different environmental factors is a lot of work. So, yep, let me move the slide forward. So, I'll stay there for a moment, but the other thing that I want to introduce myself as, when I was in library school, I was very intrigued with intellectual property, copyright, and extending electronic resource rights. And so that will be also part of my presentation. So it was a series of coincidences that started me on this campaign for information security literacy. But I think the complexity of e-resources has a lot of disciplines in it. So authentication and the responsible use of library resources are kind of in tension with one another for technology versus the license. We want our students and our librarians to seek clear and easy to understand access. The library and campus information technology, we experienced a case study, and I think as not to the degree that Emily's institution experienced a breach, but it did bring to light the challenges of communication channels at the grassroots level. And then I'm going to go into text and data mining, excessive downloads, and kind of a knowledge gap that's on campus. So my story starts really, I decided to do a brown bag presentation to our library and one of the topics throughout the year was going to be on authentication and responsible use of library resources. So originally, my supervisor suggested this brown bag series, and I was really getting stuck with kind of being the grassroots person and how do you push topics that you're finding upward. So administration can really be better informed about such things as security. So the browser changes that Heather just talked about, the dispersed publisher approaches, I was all set to talk about those. In fact, I have to laugh that I listened to all of Heather's presentations that I could find on the internet for recordings. So it's a bit ironic that we're now on a panel together a few months later. And then I think the other opportunity in preparing for these brown bags were to do a little research on my own. And one of the surprising things that I ran across that I had no intention of including is that Gen Z and cybersecurity often trade personal data for compensation. And that was the SNSI summit topic last year. And I have a citation in the resources if you'd like to go back to hear that presentation. The other nugget of information that I ran across were that 47% of 250 librarians that had been surveyed agreed that illegal sites such as Sci-Hub are really useful access to library resources, and in the one-shot teaching moments, they don't have to do a lot of side teaching on authentication, but can get right to the array of library resources and databases that we have available. So in light of that, and a series of coincidences, I was drawn into security, but I think if we go back to, I think this has been highlighted in the previous speakers, but a goal to have students and librarians seek clear and easy to understand access is good security practice. So you have off-campus and on-campus. At Davis, we use a library VPN, and I am trying to get discussions started on Open Athens. But in the meantime, when you're not on campus, you need to authenticate using a third-party software. We also have been setting up single sign-on in that mode of a one-to-one relationship with our vendors, and campus IT, library IT passes on our requests to contact and reach out to set these up at campus. And so single sign-on was an improvement over just relying on VPN due to Heather's explanation of the changing browsers. And then single sign-on also was exciting because we had an initiative that looked at seamless access. So you could log in once and move around to all the participating publishers. So really at this point, when I first started the brown bag, this is what I was going to explain and not go any further than this. But Get FTR browser tool came out. We did a session on that. We also did a session on LibKey Nomad as an extension tool. And then we all know that we have really small scholarly society presses that may have a login that the library is supposed to secure, but make available to all the authorized users. So we're never going to get everybody on the same page. And it felt like I was just making this more and more complicated by going into these brown bags on all of these various authentication methods rather than creating some clarity. So in the midst of this, we received a email from a publisher indicating that they were seeing some excessive use when compared to the previous year. So the red line was the prior year, the green line was the current activity that they saw. And so with the first spike, our library's practice is that the person who negotiates the license usually has their name on the email. That person sends it to library IT. And in this case, this was an unusual breach. It was the first time we'd had a breach with a single sign-on account. And so that meant the library IT sent it over to campus IT. And we didn't hear anything after this ticket was in place. And so I was kind of curious as to what SSO would be different than an IP breach. So I followed up with the publisher and said, you know, I don't know if I got left off of this email chain, but did you get any answer from our campus IT? And so they answered, no, we didn't get an answer, but you know, you're experiencing a second problem. So we went back to campus IT, and campus IT assured us that although the users appeared to be in a geographic location outside of the United States, that the only way they could enter the system was using Duo, the second security level, second factor authentication. And so campus IT took the ticket and said, these are authorized users. You know, if they don't use Duo, they're not going to get access. If they use Duo, then they must be authorized users. So interestingly, from the previous previous presentation, this cycle went through September, October. We had another excessive use in November. And days before winter break, I am talking to the publisher, and she said, it's not good client support to turn off your databases, but we've got to find some way to stop this. And I think one of the concerning factors was that these databases really support the University of California, Davis's medical center. So there would be a lot of clinician tools that would have to go out of service. So I continued to follow this. It ended up that the tickets were being closed one by one, and IT was not really seeing this as a pattern with the same provider. Their perspective was completely different in looking at this situation. We were successful in getting our campus IT to give the publisher more data points to see if they could discover how someone was getting access using Duo and SSO. It turned out that there were no usernames, which was an unusual situation. And campus IT also agreed no usernames were an unusual situation. So this inspired campus IT after 4 months to start digging around, and they found out that our student application portal could create a password without being assigned a UC Davis username, and that credential was providing access to our electronic resources. I'm not privileged to know if it provided access to anything else, but it did get them in the door to use library resources. So with that, I think that that was my first encounter with security, and it really got me thinking about Duo. How does someone get access to it? And I started noticing phishing emails enticing our students for superbly paid internships, and all you need to do is send me your email and your phone number. And I thought, oh, well, that is how they're getting into our users' phones to be able to authenticate Duo. The next case study is the law of unintended consequences. And I think the desire to access e-resources does involve a lot of factors. So ironically, this was exactly during the prior breach. And I'm trying to be the go-between between campus IT, library IT, and the publisher. So during the same time frame, I was copied on a email thread that was making me feel like I was reading a electronic resource librarian novel in the next episode. But a second publisher sent an excessive download email. This time it was associated with an IP address. And so again, our process is to pass the email to from technical services to library IT. And in this case, library IT identifies the users, and to my surprise, the users are then their names are given to judicial service or judicial affairs. So the email that I received once this was all done was a frantic email from the faculty who said, my students have come to me and said they followed my instructions to select a journal and to compare and contrast the change in the articles over the entire life of the journal. They've been downloading articles, and now it appears that they're in trouble, and they have black marks that will forever live with them on their academic record, and you've ruined these great students. So our associate university librarian reassured them that this is just a warning. There are no records that are going to be permanently in their academic file. And so in doing this brown bag and this story catching up, one of the points I wanted to make to our librarians was, can you be proactive as a department liaison and question faculty as to whether they're going to do a text and data mining assignment, and that the library is here to help. And really within this scenario, Davis has no interaction with judicial affairs. Judicial affairs just lets the student know that there's been a problem. And the library has actually explicitly told me that they don't want to be in the role of disciplinarian. So there is no cue to send the student back to the library to learn about text and data mining, how we can help them do this legitimately, and tools that would even make it simpler for them, because they were really taking a long approach to how they were doing this. So I think I want to close. A lot of points that have been made throughout this have closed with ways you can fix things. Maybe Heather wasn't as specific in that area, but I think one of the takeaways that I had in kind of educating upward is taking SNSI's tips for academic librarians. And the point I would really come away with from the incidents that we've had is that, you know, sharing your password information and credentials, you were tied into other personal identifiable systems such as HR, you know, student payment, and it can become a crime of opportunity that you shared your password to allow someone to read an article, to read an ebook. Now that person has shared your credentials again. And I think the other takeaway, or the other short story that I want to share in closing, that artificial intelligence is, you know, I'm sure all of us have 20 occasions to hear of this term in our email every single day. And I sit on a university-wide library committee with provosts and faculty from across the system. And we were discussing one meeting that there was a opportunity here with artificial intelligence for our resource services to begin looking at how we can do data pools and make our data more mineable. And then we were in the next session talking about libraries helping grant recipients deliver their final research to federal agencies. And so in my thinking, I suggested that perhaps these two could be bridged, and that if we were delivering our research to the federal agencies, could we create this data pool? Well, everyone was very quick to point out to me that their expectation was that they would want to mine all research, not just UC Davis's research. And so in my head, I'm thinking about the copyright, the ability to pay for that much in budgetary resources, and that copyright, technology, all of these issues kind of come to a head. But it did make me realize that there are foreign countries that are not paying as much attention to copyright. And artificial intelligence is a huge driver right now, economically, politically. And so there is a lot of tension. And I think, again, as an electronic resource librarian, you see all of these environmental factors kind of flooding your environment at once. And so the campaign to build a strong information security defense, you can come from the grassroots, but it is a difficult job. And I don't have the, the administrative strategic planning ability that Ellen was able to, or I'm sorry, Emily was able to lend to the Nebraska Medical Center. So it is an upward fight. And I definitely agree with the suggestion that you stick together in professional participation, professional communities to make sure that you are taking action around cybersecurity and collectively trying to get the word out. So with that, I think I'm not leaving Matthew much time here, but I think he's got a poll for us again.
Thank you, Michelle. I think our participants want to hear more from you than they do me, so that's absolutely fine. We can make do with the time that we have here. So as promised, we're going to ask just one more poll to get a better understanding of how we did today, and if our speakers were able to reach you and help improve your confidence or convince you to perhaps take action or to do more reading. So after this webinar, are you confident and are going to start developing tools and ideas? Are you more confident on a personal level that at least you could protect yourself from cybersecurity threats? Are you planning to at least reach out to campus IT and information security units to discuss concerns and perhaps develop a plan? Or are you still scared? Do we take a step backwards? I hope not. I don't like that last option, but we had to put it in there. So if we could just give a few more seconds to answer that poll and just see what we got in terms of results. So this is actually a decent, I feel like, division of answers here. But at least we're kind of trending, I think, in the right direction, that there's more confidence than not. I did, in the interest of time, I know that we have a Q&A session sort of queued up here. And thankfully, our panelists have answered, I think, the majority of the questions in the poll, in the Q&A module. There was one question that went unanswered that got a few upvotes that I wanted to ask the panel, though perhaps more directed at Michelle and Emily, is, it comes from Joseph, is what are some of your must-read articles in trying to convince IT or leadership about the benefits of Open Athens? This particular participant's institution is looking at moving away from proxy. Our university is moving to Microsoft SSO for our internal system, but not every library vendor is using Microsoft. And I think that you're probably hard pressed to kind of deliver a particular article or a set of articles right now. But I was wondering, Emily, in particular, you spoke about the migration over to Open Athens taking many, many years, I believe was the expression you used, although maybe I've missed that. Are there resources or arguments that can be used to sort of convince IT and leadership on the benefits of Open Athens, or Michelle, perhaps even your own musings as well? And if not, that's totally fine because we have 2 minutes left, but I thought I would throw it out there as the last outstanding question.
Emily, go for it.
This is gonna, it's gonna be a much longer answer. I don't know of current resources. It was important in the context of our institution to kind of move this way with our IT to segment our resources. I would like to ask for current resources and pass those along maybe a little bit later, if that's okay. I want to ask my person who's really deep in with our authentication what they would share in this case.
Thank you. There was, well, I don't know if Michelle, if you had something to add. If not, there was one more question that had come up really quickly because we're at 2 minutes, but comes from Matthew actually, and he just a follow-up on IP or rather authorization. And the question, I think, is it correct to infer that there are minimal security concerns in terms of IP authorization possibly being a vulnerability? Just the privacy concerns that browsers are responding to? Is that, is that a correct inference? I guess that could be to anyone, really.
That's a really interesting question.
I think Heather is going to be the best person to answer that one.
Okay.
I'm going to defer to you, Heather.
Okay.
Right. So IP addresses have a very unique set of security challenges associated with them that aren't the same as what you might expect with username and passwords or even the federated authentication. So, I mean, it's kind of an apples and oranges comparison. The security concerns will be things like IP addresses can be spoofed, they can be tracked, they can be blocked in some interesting ways. So you'll just have a whole different set of problems with them, I think, than the vulnerabilities that you might be expecting with regards to federated authentication.
I think that's especially true. I wasn't even thinking about spoofing when I answered you earlier, Matthew. It was, yeah, you're placing a lot of trust into what is kind of an ungovernable because it can be spoofed because there are lots of other things that go into IP authentication. I feel like it's just not as governable. Is that a fair assessment, Heather?
I think so. And I know we're at time. I have the fortune of dealing with, talking to some of the people that actually wrote the original IP protocol, the Internet Protocol standard. And when I tell them how it's being used, they're like, that's not what it was designed for.
Right.
Great that that's, you found an interesting way to use it, but that's not what it was meant to do. So protecting it is challenging.
Thank you both. Yeah, we are over time now, so I just wanted to thank all our panelists, Emily, Carlota, Heather, Michelle, for your insights today, ACRL Choice for their assistance in coordinating this event, and to everyone who's still on the call, but who were able to attend and listen to this important discussion. I think we covered a lot of great ground today. Like good librarians, we've cited our sources, we've referenced in a concise bibliography, which we just passed by, and there's some additional resources that you can review later. And then the very last slide, you'll be receiving a follow-up email from Joyce with a copy or the link to the recording and this deck. And I'd also like to highlight again the SNSI website, which is snsi.info, to help guide your ongoing efforts for institutional cybersecurity. Once again, thank you for your participation. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and have a great rest of your day. I think with that, I'll pass back to Sabrina to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, I'll just echo you and say thanks so much to Matt, Emily, Carlota, Heather, and Michelle for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. As Matt said, we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording and where to access the slides. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session and hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.